So universal basic income is the idea that every single person in the country gets a regular amount into their bank account that is unconditional. So it doesn't matter if you're working or not working, what your life conditions are, you get this set amount of money. And that set amount of money is a modest amount that ultimately makes sure it's covering your food, rent, and probably your transport if you're going to job interviews or to work. Now, the only exceptions to this, for instance, if you are long-term disabled or you're on benefits at the moment, there's something called a ratchet mechanism. So that means you need to make sure that you're better off than you are under the current system. So no one who is in the poorest kind of decile should be worse off after a universal basic income. The people who will be worse off are the super rich, multimillionaires and billionaires, because we'll be charging them more tax. And I think to most people, unless you're in that 1%, that just seems sensible. And even the 1% think that's sensible as well, some of them.
It is like a really bold idea, and it's one that sort of, come in and out of vogue, right? There's been lots of trials. There was ones in like the 70s and the 90s in Canada, more recently in the Netherlands, now in Wales. What do you want to tell us about some places that it has been implemented and the findings that have come from it?
Totally. I'd love to take you back to the 13th century, first of all, but very briefly before everyone switches off. But Pericles said that giving people a basic income would essentially be better to stop thieving than hanging. So he saw it as like poverty prevention to stop crime. Now that's not the frame I'd use in the modern day, because crime is not an absence of moral character, it's an absence of money that often draws people to steal. But I think the point stands that if you make society so unequal, then people will be driven to desperate measures. In Finland, they've run a universal basic income. They focused it on increasing employment, which for me is not the point. And what they found was it didn't necessarily increase employment. But what it did increase was mental health, well-being, people's sense of community, all things that I would say are absolutely the things that we should be increasing. In Wales, they've just run a trial for the last few years with care leavers. The Welsh government, sadly, has decided not to continue the trial because they couldn't see the instant results of it. But by 2027, we should be seeing the results of the young people who just come out of care experience, young people out of from age 18. And I imagine their lives will be better. It's just obvious that if you give people a bit of money to support them, they'll do better.
What were their findings that made them decide to discontinue it?
Well, it was largely about money. So obviously the First Minister changed. There's been a lot of kind of turbulence. So I think a lot of that was around politics. But actually, when you talk to the people who were involved with the trial, who were involved with the research and including the interim findings, everything was looking really, really positive. In Alaska, not a place you would necessarily go, oh, they've done a universal basic income there. But they actually did a basic income, they've been doing it for decades now, around oil resource. So the oil that comes from Alaska is then shared, the kind of the income from it is shared among the citizens. Now, as a Green, I'm not running to say, let's extract more oil. But I think the principle ultimately of saying what is in the common good and is shared by the commons, I'd rather that's owned by the public rather than private companies. So I think that's the other point around the universal basic income. At its very root, it's sensing the idea that the land and as such wealth that has come from the land, which is how all wealth came, effectively if we look through colonization or empire, should actually not be with the super wealthy and the super rich, but actually should be shared amongst all of us, and we should particularly look after the poorest in our communities.
And you talk about it on also a practical perspective, right? Like the places that have been implemented, maybe not on employment rates, but on other things. I think even sometimes it's found that hospital admissions have gone down, and people who are able to get out of abusive relationships because they've got that sort of base of money to support themselves. But what I guess everybody does think of is, does it increase employability? Does it mean that people are reluctant to work? Is that the right way to even be thinking about this?
Yeah, it also increases people's nutritional rates as well, which is another side effect. I respect the question, but I think it's completely the wrong way to look at it, and I'll dig into why. People often say, why don't we look at a full employment kind of model in the country to get everyone into a job? And I think this is where neoliberalism and capitalism has kind of led us to, is the idea that you're not worth something or you're not contributing to society unless you have a job. Now, I think people working is great, but I'd love us to move away from the idea of labour and more towards the idea of work. So making sure that when people are doing the work that they're doing, they're finding it fulfilling, that it's contributing to society in some way. Now, there are some jobs that I guess people aren't running to do and say, well, no, but those jobs need doing. Well, exactly, but then people would have to pay people more to do that work. And so I think that is a benefit for everyone. The idea, though, I think, is when you look at art and creativity, that contributes so much to society, but artists so often are left either having to sell out and just go to the highest bidder to make that art or creativity, or aren't able to do it at all. So we're missing some of the best artists or creatives of our generation, of our lifetime, because they're forced into jobs that they don't want to do rather than being able to do what they want to do. Politics is another example. A lot of people who are elected are able to engage in politics. People who come from middle class or educated backgrounds, and it's not to knock their contribution, we need everyone involved, but it has shut out a whole load of people. So being able to give people a basic income would open doors for lots and lots of different spaces. The idea, though, that someone wouldn't work because they didn't need to, I think is completely wrong. Most people I talk to enjoy the work that they do, and they thrive from it. And actually, when they looked at Kenya as an example of where a basic income has been run, more businesses are opening up, more initiatives are opening up, because people suddenly go, I don't need to worry about the basics like food and rent, that's covered. So actually, rather than surviving, I can start to thrive. And I can think that can only be a good thing for everyone.
I mean, do you think that the idea of something like UBI will become more popular as we move into a society where, you know, there are fewer jobs mainly, and, you know, people don't have to work because of, I mean, like Sam Altman, for example, talks about like, the introduction of AI and how that's going to eradicate a lot of jobs, and therefore maybe that will lead us to need to redefine our relationship to work, or the idea of having to work?
I think that's exactly right. And I think there's a real opportunity there to talk about things like a 4-day working week, for people to have more flexible working hours, and just to have a re-examination of society about where people feel like they're on the rat run of a treadmill the entire time, and actually finding ways for people to breathe. The scary part of this question, if I'm not being optimistic, is I think it's inevitable actually. I don't think it's a question of if, I think a question of when. And the reason why I'm pushing it now, and it's not explicitly a left-wing idea, in fact Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and people who are, I was going to say even more explicitly on the right, but you don't get more explicitly on the right than a Nazi salute at a rally, so I think we can put Elon Musk in that category. And they don't want this, spoiler alert, for good reasons. They don't want it because of the same reasons that I'm putting forward, to nourish people, for people to have more empowerment over their lives, or for people to feel more connected to their local community. They want it because they actually want a movement of public wealth to private capital, and also making sure that they can control more data, that they can have a more kind of all-consuming state. And that also has lots of questions about surveillance too. So I think all of these things are things that make me nervous, and I don't pretend to have the answers to them. So that's why we really need politicians right now to be saying, this is inevitably where we're going to. There are huge positives that can come out of all of this, and AI is the same conversation, by the way. I don't reject AI as some like Philistine or just some like knee-jerk reaction. I think AI has some amazing possibilities, particularly around healthcare, and also work that people don't want to do that could be moved to AI, and actually we can make sure people have jobs they enjoy more and are paid better. But also AI has some hugely worrying consequences. So I think all of these conversations are right here, right now. They're not around the corner anymore. So we need to start having these discussions and being honest about the inevitable consequences.
I mean, they are right here, right now, but still a lot of people aren't talking about them, right? Like, Labour's been elected on a mandate that's like far from radical, and it seems like this embrace of new, radical, big, bold ideas is not what people are wanting at the moment.
Well, Labour are in this absurd situation where they're betting everything on growth, despite the fact when public are polled frequently, they say, do you think growth will improve your material living conditions? And people say no. And guess what? They're right, because actually under Margaret Thatcher there was more growth than almost ever before, but inequality got even bigger. So the Labour government are focusing their kind of interventions in completely the wrong place, and in fact I would argue they're going to worsen inequality. So I don't think we can look to this government to suggest the kind of transformation that this country needs.
Would you say their election is a rejection of radicalism? Obviously, like, they're incredibly moderate and so many people voting for them.
No, because I think the real people who won during this election was the vast majority who didn't vote at all, who were vastly alienated, who look at the two-party political system and go, that's utterly broken, I'm not interested anymore. Now, of course, the danger there is reform is really waiting in the wings. In fact, they're not waiting in the wings anymore. Nigel Farage is right in the middle of a stage singing his solo. And so it's really important that we have the Green Party and the left movements more widely being able to present alternatives that are benefiting to people's lives. And I think it's really important that we don't sell the ingredients of the recipes, so we don't get stuck into really kind of policy detail, but actually we say this is how your life's going to be better. And that's where universal basic income comes in. Who doesn't want more money in their pocket every month? Who doesn't want to be told that your rent can be covered, you won't be worried about eating or paying the heat, and you'll be able to get to work? What we need to do is have the credibility though, and that's where the detail comes in. And I'd love to see the government or whoever it is spending more time and effort on making sure that universal basic income can work, so we can all coalesce around the real policy and go, this is what we're supporting.
But I mean, obviously the government we've got at the moment is quite universality. They've obviously taken the rent fuel allowance away. I mean, if you're saying that this is something that appeals to so many people, where's the chasm that's going in that is not really being discussed as a serious policy?
Yeah, the idea that targeting works better is absolutely madness, and kind of every single study that you look, universality makes complete sense. And when we talk particular about the benefit system and how it works at the moment, we are putting billions of pounds just into the administration of it. So that is dehumanising for the person who is claiming money, but it's also dehumanising for all those public sector workers who are having to sit in front of a human being and decide if their disability is disabled enough when people have long-term health conditions, and work out how they can cut corners. So that system absolutely does not work. And when people say, is a universal basic income, can we afford it? Well, we could take all of those billions of pounds that are into administration right now and put it straight into a UBI. There's another much bigger conversation about we have a sovereign nation in terms of our financial, we can choose what we spend money on, so we don't need to cut corners. The government could just decide it's a priority. I think the reason why there's an absence of people calling for universality is because we've had decades since Margaret Thatcher winning the argument of there is no society, and a kind of radical individualism that has made people forget the idea that we can care about each other, that we can live in a society that is compassionate, where the government is there to look after people and make sure there is a safety net. I don't think those arguments are hard to win, though. I think they're just not often being heard in the mainstream media. So I think it's really important that whether it's in communities, whether it's through independent or local journalism, and always shout out to a local journalism, that we're having those conversations, because actually more and more mainstream media is dying. And actually, I think people are going other places to get their news. The important thing that we need is correct information.
I mean, what is that argument that, like, as you say, like, as a society we have shifted towards this quite individualistic point of view? Like, you've even got the work, like now you've got the work and pensions department saying, well, the people are really almost like taking advantage of the system that, you know, lots of people would already say is completely inadequate. I mean, how do you even change the idea? You know, I mean, you've said before, people want to work, and that's true. Like, people want value in their lives. They want to feel like they're contributing. They want to feel like they're earning, you know, providing for their family, providing for themselves, all of those things. But still, people view those who, you know, are having to rely on the benefit system as less than or taking advantage. I mean, how do you even start to change that view of like, the poorest people in our society?
So I think we have to talk about inequality at every single moment that we can, which is why I started this interview doing that. Got people like Gary Stevenson, who are really important in this because they're someone who's very wealthy, who is going, but this isn't fair. We've got a group called the Patriotic Millionaires, who it does what it says on the tin. They're a group of millionaires who are saying, actually, our wealth should be taxed more because we have mass inequality in society. I think the second part is around arts and culture. So for decades, particularly because the people who can afford to tell stories are often funded by the super rich. And so we had decades of programs on TV, reality TV programs, or supposedly reality TV programs, but also documentaries like Benefit Street that constantly demonize some of the poorest people in society, and also demonize migrants. And we know the problems in society are not people who are working and are still claiming benefits, or people who are migrants, or the people who can't get a job. The problems in society, again, are the 1%, the multimillionaires and billionaires, who are not paying their fair share in tax, who are avoiding tax, and the nom-doms. So we need to point that out. But what we really need is more than politicians just saying it over and over again, because that gets boring, with full respect to myself and colleagues. But actually we need those powerful stories, people like Ken Loach, who told those amazing stories and those amazing films, but we need those much more regularly, because I think if people can see the truth through narrative, I think that is how you change hearts and minds. And beyond that as well, I think we need organised campaigns going door to door, having these conversations one-on-one with people, so people understand that when we act collectively and when we act in solidarity, we are so much more stronger. And that's the only way we're going to survive as a society, because partly the climate crisis and the inequality crisis are caused by the same thing, exploitation, and we need to call that out.
And I mean, how realistic do you think like, we could maybe see UBI implemented in our lifetimes?
Oh, I'm almost definite it will happen.
Really?
And I don't mean that to sound naive, because I'm not convinced it will happen in a positive way. I think it could happen where a right-wing or far-right government get hold of it and it's used for ill, in the same way that, you know...
How would it be used for ill? Like, maybe explain what that would look like.
Yeah, so I suppose, like, you start to create conditions on the money. So you take away all benefits, you get rid of that system, and you start to say you can have this money based on these conditions. We've seen this a little bit under David Cameron, and I think under Boris Johnson, this idea of workfare. So you can have your benefits if you go work for a corporate company. You also happen to be donating to the government. So not only is that corporate company receiving free labour, the government are also subsidising them. And so there's lots of complications there about how private wealth and capital work around how people are given this money. I think also people could start to mess around with the rates and say, oh, these people have contributed this month, so we'll make it volunteerism, in the same way that David Cameron's Big Society wasn't necessarily an awful thing, but the way it was presented as a cover for austerity was really awful. So there's loads of catches there.
At that point, it's no longer universal, right?
Totally. So I think that's why it's also really important. We always talk about what a universal basic income is, and it's always about that modest sum that is regularly into people's accounts. And it's also important it's individual, because you talked earlier or briefly about women's empowerment, and so it's important that it doesn't go to a family or a household where people can control that money, but actually goes into every single individual's bank account.
And I mean, in some of the places where we've seen it implemented, even in, I guess, like, if you look at the care leavers in Wales, even though that's been discontinued, even in those things, when you're implementing it to a certain section of people, it's not really universal at that stage. So how can you measure, any supposed benefits if it was going to be implemented on a scale?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because in London, actually, there's 2 trials that are looking to be piloted in Jarrow out of London in the northeast, which is where the March for Workers went, so it's a symbolic place. Now, I've been pushing for those pilots to happen, but you're right, we will get data from them, but people can accurately say afterwards, oh, but it wasn't universal. And of course, if you go to a certain group of people and say, do you want free money, and give it to them, then afterwards, of course, they will say that was a great thing. But my argument is, well, yes, and that will happen on a national level too, so why do we even need to do a pilot? And actually, if we want to talk about piloting something, we've been piloting neoliberalism now for 40, 50 years, and it's utterly failed. So we know the current system doesn't work. We know that the water companies being in private hands rather than being nationalised doesn't work, but still we seem to be persisting with that kind of trial. We know that rent controls, we had them until the 1970s. They were taken away for private rent that is now controlled, and we've had price gouging. That doesn't work, but we're still going on ahead with it. So to answer your question, I don't really think we need pilots. I think we should have we should just go for it, because it's obvious to me that if you give people more money to cover their food and rent, they're going to be happier, and that is going to, inflation is the argument that people often use. Will it cause inflation? But actually, if you create more demand and create more supply in work, that actually just boosts investment, it boosts the economy. It's exactly what the government should be doing right now by funding capital investment. They're not doing that either. But this is another way of doing it in terms of making sure everyone's got a bit more money, so people can be more productive, they can have more businesses, they can have more supply. The only time when you need to start worrying about it is if we've run out of natural resource, and then that's when inflation can start to go up. We are nowhere near that place, so let's not worry about that. Let's get people as productive as possible.
And isn't it true as well that, like, one of the things that once you give everybody, money to cover their basic needs, it also means that you kind of go away from this scarcity mentality, and you often have people making smart decisions on their own personal scale. So for all of those people who say, people need to make better individual decisions, well, actually providing enough money for them to cover their basic needs enables them to do that.
Absolutely, and every time I brought this up, in the London Assembly or on the national stage, people say, what if they spend it on drugs or alcohol? The first thing I'd say is, when I walk past a homeless person in the street and someone goes, don't give them money, they might spend it on alcohol. I go, well, if I don't particularly drink, but if I was on the street and I was freezing cold on a night like this, I'd probably want to drink inside me too. So first of all, I have a problem with us judging other people's behaviour like that. But second, I also just think that's a real misjudgment about why people go to alcohol or drugs or use them problematically sometimes. And often, again, it's about poverty, it's about mental health worries about poverty. And actually, if you deal with the poverty, which is the problem, then people are less likely to turn to alcohol or drugs in problematic ways. So again, I just think it's a very kind of maternalistic or paternalistic attitude on society that again has been fed by Thatcherism and the Labour government with that kind of top-down approach as opposed to trusting the decisions that people make.
And I mean, how much realistically would it cost to implement this?
Well, it really depends on the model that you use, but that's a boring answer, so let me give you an example. If you set it at, say, £1,000 to £1,600 a month for every single citizen, so we're talking about 60 million people, times 12, we're looking at about £60 billion. Now, for so I'm not sounding naive here, that's more than we have in GDP at the moment to spend. But first of all, already, we're taking away the whole kind of system around administration and benefits and sanctions. You're already getting a whole load of money there. You are removing the loopholes around non-doms, you're removing the tax loopholes. That's another load of £1 billion. You're looking at a wealth tax, making sure that we're taxing multimillionaires and billionaires 1% on £10 million or more. You're looking at 30 to £50 billion. You're bringing capital gains tax in line with income tax. All that means is at the moment we tax people who earn their wealth more than gain their wealth. That is completely unfair. And also comes back to universal basic income. People go, why are we giving people money for free? Well, hello, inherited wealth. That's literally what you're doing. So anyway, those are lots of measures, and I could fire lots more measures at you, but I won't because it'll get boring. But I think ultimately if we transform our economy, which is what a universal basic income would be doing, we'd ultimately be moving the wealth away from the 1% towards every single citizen. That sounds like a transformation worth getting behind.
Well, we're in this situation now where we say, oh, let's tax the rich and all of those things. But really, those people who you're taxing have managed to sort of mobilise this threat that if you do that, all the business would rain from the UK. I mean, what do you say to that? That's obviously been enough to convince the Labour government to make a lot of decisions that are in favour of big business.
I think it's absolutely ludicrous, and I'd even say it's because of the big business are funding the Labour government. Literally, oil and gas companies and arms trades. This isn't something I'm making up. We saw that they took a £4 million donation from Quadrucha Capital, one of the biggest donations that the Labour government Labour Party have ever taken. But to come to your question more widely, they have painted this kind of narrative, and it's a ludicrous narrative. First of all, the reason why people have their money in this country is in assets. They're not easy to move, and if you do move them, let's have an exit tax to make sure we're getting the money on the way out. Also, groups like the patriotic millionaires are saying that is not why they invest in this country. They invest in this country because there is a history in this country, there's culture in this country, they have family and community in this country, and they don't just want to get up and leave. But what I'd say more than any of that is if you have a multimillionaire or billionaire who is benefiting from this country, because if someone commits a crime, the police will come and help them. If their child is going to university, they are being educated. If someone in their family needs to use the National Health Service, or a worker within their company is using the National Health Service, they are benefiting from it. If they do not want to pay a fair share of tax to contribute to this country's National Health Service, to our police, to our social housing, then let's wave them and kick their butt on the way out the door, because actually we don't need them in this country and they're not helping in this country. That is not all rich people, that is not all business owners. Many of them do want to contribute, let's support those. But if people are going to go, if I have to contribute just a little bit more tax, I'm going to leave, let's wave them off.